Welcome back, everybody, to Between Two Sermons. It is so great to have you here with us. Rob Catalani sitting here next to me again.
John Amayo.
Welcome back.
Yes.
You've been across the world, and now you're back.
I am.
Back here
Great.
in Kosovo. You weaved a little bit of that into the sermon.
Yes. How could I help?
Yeah.
But not do that? Yeah.
Absolutely.
But no, it's a great trip. Great trip.
Thankfully you did, and I'm sure we'll hear more about it.
Yes, hopefully.
But why don't we dive into this sermon
let's
as
do it.
always?
Let's do it.
And just get down to it. All of a sudden, we're in Acts, still weaving our way through. We learned last week about Saul and his pretty dramatic conversion. Right. You have the gospel going out, and it's reaching this new place called Antioch.
Right.
And all of a sudden, in this new place, there's people from all over the world. You did a good job describing the dynamics of Antioch. They're called Christians for the first time in Antioch.
Right.
Before that, you hear them called the Way or whatever. What is the significance of that? Maybe we'll start there. What's the significance of it?
This isn't my insight only, but I think my sense is the sense of people in history and that Luke's making a point. Mm-hmm. And not only are we, almost in the middle of the book of Acts, not quite in the middle, but getting there. The church, a lot has changed, as you just mentioned. Nobody really knows what Antioch is. And I mean, it's not that significant today to us, the word or the city, but in the history of the early New Testament, it's huge. It's like, the church now is a new center. Mm-hmm. And that it's a geographical center, as you say. It's not in Israel anymore. It's in Europe, or we would say modern-day Turkey. And a lot of the people, even in this first couple of paragraphs, it says, many Greeks came, which is a way of saying non-Jewish people. And the church is changing in its demography. It's changing in where it is, in its demography and geography. And then you might say it's beginning to act differently, or maybe act in ways that were so unique to the culture around it. Mm-hmm. This is my impression, or people's impression, is that Luke says, now's the time I'm going to make this point. Mm. They were called Christians first here. So you and I, that's a term we've known forever. That's what anyone that's a follower of Jesus, another way of saying it, we call ourselves Christians. That's as old as most of us think of the whole church history as people who follow Jesus, but they weren't all called that. And the idea seems to be that the church had experienced enough changes and growth and development and some sense of newness. There was enough change and development from its origins to say, now it has landed. Yes, it has roots going back to the Old Testament. Yes, Jesus was the Jewish Messiah, but the Church of Jesus Christ has now maybe established itself as its own thing in its own right. And Luke is maybe saying in these verses, this is what distinguishes it. They're called Christians here. So that seems significant to me.
Yeah, it does seem significant. And, as I was just thinking about that, the idea of the word Christian, I don't know if in your study of it, did it seem like a pejorative term during the time or did it seem like a compliment? Because I've kind of heard it both ways.
Yeah.
Where because technically it's little Christ.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
So how did you?
Yeah, my sense is that it was descriptive. Yeah. So that there are other times when terms are used pejoratively, as you say. Even certainly with Jews, there was many cases, even Palestinian. Its roots, some would say, was meant to be by the Roman government a pejorative for Jewish people. But my sense is that, back to your point about little Christ, that it was descriptive. It was like, what do we call this? Mm-hmm. And Jesus, Christ, the our Lord and Savior, who's at the center of this, his death and resurrection, the transformation of people's lives from all kinds of people, as you were mentioning a second ago, and this passage names a lot of these people groups. I think it was like, I take it as descriptive, that they're saying, what else should we call these people? They're what they seem to have tied all of their life change to, why they are differentiating themselves from as a group of people is because of their relationship to Christ. So they're Christians.
Yeah.
That's my sense.
Yeah, that makes sense. That makes a lot of sense. And I love how you pointed out that really what the gospel does that's different than other religions is it kind of supersedes culture. I don't know what the word you use, but that it transcends culture.
Yes.
It can work its way into any culture.
Yes.
I know it's kind of got a bad vibe to it now, post-pandemic, but
Yeah.
it's almost this viral sense in
Yes.
which it adjusts to wherever it is and takes over.
One of the great insights, I'll just mention
Yeah.
this book quickly, Alamin Sane, which is a strange name because he's from Gambia, and so it's a name that they use in Gambia, first and last name. But he's now a professor at Yale, a School of Mission and World Christianity, whose religion is Christianity. So just a small book and interesting, but he basically makes the point, which I never quite thought of in exactly this way, that the gospel or Christianity, maybe distinguishing from other world religions, is not so much tied to a particular location, and it's not tied, therefore, to culture. Some people would say that most religions, maybe you're a scholar or I don't know, someone who's just trying to be objective about religion. You're not yourself a believer of all kind, and say religion is essentially a creation of culture, whether it's the Hindu culture, the Buddhist culture, the European culture, whatever. That religion is a creation of culture. So there's a lot of ways in which you see the value system is reflective or expressed in the ideas or the idioms of culture, and that's what it is. It's good as far as it goes. If you're, you live in Europe or America or the West, maybe you're more Christian than not for those reasons. And if you're live in the Middle East or in North Africa, you're Muslim for these reasons, and so it goes. But what Sane says is not so much that really Christianity, even looking at the present expression, the 21st century, that Christianity is really all over the map. Unlike other world religions, it's not really, if you look at the percentage of Christians, even today, they're not tied around the Middle East. In fact, most of them aren't there. I think the majority of Christians today are in Central and South America. And so just as one example, and it's growing maybe in rapidly in Asia, China in particular, so that even today, Christianity is not so much tied to its roots as far as geographical roots. And his real point is that Christianity, the gospel, is sort of subculture. It's not meant to just be at home in one culture, right? It fits really good in this one and not so good in other ones. Nor is it meant to erase or eliminate culture. Like I was Chinese and now I'm a Christian and I'm not Chinese anymore or whatever. But that the gospel is meant to go deeper than culture. Yeah. It touches us in the deepest parts of who we are, and then it's not meant to bring with it the American culture or the Eastern culture or the African culture or wherever it comes from in that point in time in history, but it meant to bring forth to redeem culture. In other words, it critiques culture, if whether it's an African culture, a Chinese culture, an American culture, if there are things about the culture that the gospel can speak to, in other words, it's from outside of culture, it's from God, we believe the gospel, it may critique my culture, it may bring redemption to my culture, but ultimately, the gospel should help bring new forms and celebrate and help any culture express itself uniquely within its cultural voice. So if I'm making sense in all those last few sentences, it's definitely a unique idea, because I think some people, I don't know about those of us in our church, sometimes think the criticism, let's say, of the church, whether you're people like you and me inside of it and we're a little shy about it, or people outside of the church say, well, Christianity is almost, it's sort of a religion for X kind of people. Or it's, people used to say about missions that it's colonialism, that what they were doing in the 18th and 19th century, whether it was in Europe, particularly the missions movement that started in much of Central Western Europe and then America, it's bringing, yes, Jesus, but also bringing pieces of the American culture, like even look at the expansion of the British Empire. It's bringing along the pieces of the culture and saying, if you want to be a Christian, you need to dress this way, sing this way, maybe even organize your economy this way. Where Sane would say, that's not the case, although that's been done.
Yeah.
But maybe some of the reasons that the church has started and then stalled in some places is because those cultural trappings were not meant to be part of the gospel message. And the best places where the gospel has really grown and continues to thrive is when the gospel critiques culture but allows any given culture. In other words, nobody has a corner. No culture has a corner on the gospel. It's the gospel is for all people, and if it's received in its fullest form, and we continue to allow it to have its impact on our lives, it expresses itself in unique ways within every culture. And the Holy Spirit's job is to recreate the gospel, the life of Jesus within every culture. Which you go to the end of the New Testament, many could quote this, we're looking there in heaven and it says, we find people there of every tribe, every tongue, every nation. In other words, we don't have this uniform, quote unquote, Christian culture. We have Christ expressed in all cultures.
No, yeah. I just want to, as you're talking, I'm thinking missiology here. I'm thinking the way the gospel spreads throughout the world, maybe how it's even coming back. We don't have the time to get on all of that, but it is fascinating as you look at the way the gospel is currently going out into the world and maybe even making its way back to where it came from in a sense. There's this missiology.
And I want to say one quick thing before we move on, because you asked this when we were talking earlier. What difference does that make?
Right.
It's a good question. You might say, well, that's interesting, Rob and John, and it's a missiology, a point, or missiology about how the gospel spreads. But here's how I think it maybe speaks to us today. I don't know about everyone listening to you and me, but in America today, all the more in 2024, many would say evangelical Christianity and politics are for some people at some levels in our society are so interwoven that it's hard for people to even separate them. So I could be looking at the church in 2024 and go, gee, if you're asking me to come to your church, if you're asking me to consider the gospel, what I think you're saying to me is I should embrace a brand of politics. So there's an example of how in our own day, this isn't just history, where culture, a particular culture or cultural expression can be seen or experienced as part and parcel of the gospel. And I think what you and I would say is that happens, but that is not, one might say, if someone really feels strongly about that, then you could say they're a Christian, very well could be a Christian, but the gospel has not had its full work of expression in their lives because the gospel is not meant to carry that kind of baggage. And that's not even about, ethnicity. That's about a point of view, but that happens. So in this sense, it's important to think about what the gospel does. Politics is a part of culture, and how is the gospel supposed to speak into our lives in every area of our lives, and to bring and to critique, including our ideology, including our points of view, and make sure in every way we're allowing the gospel to challenge us and then redeem what needs to be redeemed and allow us to express our faith in all of our lives.
Yeah. Well, wow. I mean, that is such a very important part of how we look to shepherd in this time. We have to be so vigilant against just taking on what culture says.
That's right.
And we have to be a voice of healthy critique on both sides.
That's right.
What part of this isn't in alignment with the gospel? What part of that isn't in alignment with the gospel? And we need to be able to speak to those things.
That's right.
When those things come up. So I think that's a really great point. And that ties into your other point about being committed. These people who are really committed to the gospel at a deep level.
In some ways, we were talking earlier, this passage, it's not even that many verses, but you might say it's the end of the series the way we've organized it. It's maybe a mark of a period paragraph in the book of Acts before we go on to the missionary journeys, which many people are familiar with, Paul's expansion into the known world with the gospel. And he's saying, here's what it means. They're called Christians first in Antioch. One is this idea of the gospel is for all cultures, all people, and it redeems cultures. It's not connected to no culture has a corner on the gospel. But the other one, I think, in a few verses, is that, a growing church is not all about numbers. And a growing church a growing Christian, maybe us listening, is also about our commitment. I love Barnabas comes, this great, 13th apostle of a kind, and comes as a delegate from Jerusalem and says to come down to this new movement. They're all overwhelmed. None of this was planned. This is not a part of a strategic plan. This is the spontaneous expansion of the church, to quote a famous book. And he says, listen, what's going on here is amazing. He noticed the grace of God was at work, and he said to these many people, many of them not, as we were saying earlier, not, Gentiles in this church, that there's a tipping point of Gentiles in the church. And he says he encouraged them to stay true to the Lord with all their hearts. I love that, to stay true to the Lord. And then he goes and finds Saul, as you talked about last week. We know him as the Apostle Paul, who wrote a chunk of the New Testament and was a major person in helping to organize the life and teachings of Jesus to make the basis of our faith. And he says, these Christians, this isn't a seminary, this is just a church. He's saying these Christians, they need teaching. And it's not until they spend a year with the Apostle Paul that they're called disciples. So I just think that's a very, very important point for us too, to say, Browncroft's a great church. There are many churches like ours in this city and in this in our country, of course. But to be a member of the church, we're still called to grow. We're still trying to mature, and we don't. That doesn't happen just because we show up. We really have to engage in our faith. And I'll say this, whatever some of our programs, they're means to an end, whether that's Rooted, whether that's The Gathering, this new marriage ministry, whether it's what we do with students, how we are encouraging people in our 4 habits. This is all about, this isn't just, the X's and O's. We're saying we really need, if you really want to be a fully engaged and effective disciple of Jesus in a world that's lost, and in some ways in darkness, then we need to be drink deeply of our faith, and that means learning and growing in the teachings of Jesus in the Scriptures. And I think that's also here in this early picture of the church.
I love that. Yeah. So let's just take a moment. I think that's a great segue into people discovering, whether it's on your own or talking about it in the midst of your small group. Like, where is God inviting you as you think about, am I maturing in my walk?
Yes.
Am I growing deeper in my walk with Jesus? Where might God be inviting you into a new season, maybe, of intentional growth for you in your life? And what might that look like to even have people around you who are helping you move forward in that way?
Yeah,
so,
I like that.
I think that would be a great way to start.
Yes.
And thanks for sharing with us this week, Rob. We appreciate it. And hopefully we'll see you all back here next time on Between Two Sermons.